Hello, I'm running a little late this week, but it'll be on Facebook forever. I mean, YouTube. Anyway, last week's patron video was on Paul at Ephesus. This week, I thought I would follow up with the church at Ephesus. And here we really don't know a lot. We have, of course, some second century traditions, and I don't deal with them in this video, Polycarp and those sorts of things, who is at least nearby, if not at Ephesus at some point. But I want to talk a little bit about echoes in the rest of the New Testament that may or may not relate to Ephesus. And so we'll see what we come up with. Actually, quite a bit of candidates, although you'll have to decide what you think. Well, I want to start off with Romans 16. And first glance, it's like, well, what are you thinking? Romans 16 is in Romans. It's to Rome. And so why are you putting it in a video on the church at Ephesus? Well, as you might guess, there are some scholars in the past who've thought that Romans 16 actually reads like something that would more likely have been for Ephesus than for Rome. Now, I'm not sure that the current consensus leans that direction. In Robert Jewett's a recent Romans commentary, which is very thick and kind of the latest big deal, he doesn't go that way at all. But I still find these arguments quite, they needle at me. And of course, we can't prove it, unfortunately, and I don't think we ever will be able to prove it. So we just have to deal with it. But I want to present the argument here. First, Paul seems to know an awful lot of people in a lot of specific house churches for a place that he's never been before, Rome. In fact, there is way more information in Romans 16 than we get about any church Paul ever was at. In all of Paul's other letters, in his closing greetings, there ain't nothing like Romans 16. It's just highly suspicious that Paul would know that many specific people in that many places in a place he's never been to before. I've already mentioned that. Here's another thing. He greets Priscilla and Aquila. Well, in Acts, the last thing we knew in Acts 18 and 17, Priscilla and Aquila were at Ephesus. And then again in 2 Timothy, Priscilla and Aquila are in Ephesus. Now, of course, it's certainly possible. We're talking about a number of years here. So it's perfectly possible that Priscilla and Aquila could go to Rome. They were from Rome, right? Stay there a while and then come back to Ephesus just in time for 2 Timothy. I mean, that's all possible. However, it is interesting that Priscilla and Aquila, before and after Romans 16 was written, were at Ephesus. And so, I wonder. Let's keep going. Epenetus is mentioned in Romans 16 as the first convert of Asia. Again, perfectly possible that Epenetus decided to move from Asia to Rome and that he was there just in time for Paul to greet him in Romans 16. Possible. However, it's also possible that Romans 16 wasn't written to Rome, but to Ephesus. And of course, Phoebe. Romans 16 is basically a letter of commendation. Phoebe was a deacon of the church of Cenchrea, which is at Corinth. And so, could it be that at the same time that Paul wrote Romans, Paul also wrote this letter of commendation? And of course, he would have kept a copy with him, in addition to sending the letter to Rome and sending the letter with Phoebe if she went somewhere different. Could it be that the copy he made for himself had both in the same document? And here's where we find that there are actually manuscript issues. There are the ending of Romans is messy in the manuscripts. Now, it's not like there are manuscripts that have a clear break and that don't have Romans 16. All the manuscripts, I think, have Romans 16, I think. But some of them have a conclusion before Romans 16. So anyway, I didn't review the details. I'm on the road, but it seems to me that there is a lot of messiness in the ending of Romans, which may be an artifact of something along these lines. So the dating of Romans 16 is about 51, 58. Now, if again, I don't plan to die for this. It's just if I have to vote today, do you think Romans 16 is for Ephesus, or do you think Romans 16 is for Rome? If I had to vote today, I'd vote for Ephesus. So if Romans 16 is for Ephesus, then Priscilla and Aquila are at Ephesus. Andronicus and Junia are there, who are said to be apostles. By the way, I don't like the translation relatives of Paul. I think they're Jews, is what he's saying. They're my kinsmen. They're Jewish brothers and sister. Junia, they are prominent among. They're well known among the apostles. They're prominent among the apostles. Um, I personally lean toward the interpretation that basically sees these two as apostles. They were in the Lord before Paul. It's quite possible they are two of the 500 that saw Christ at once and therefore had a commission. The manuscript evidence, some manuscripts have changed Junia to Junius, suggesting that she's a man, not a woman, which implies that there were people who felt the weight of this passage as pointing to her, a woman, as being an apostle. So they're there at Ephesus, if it's Ephesus. Phoebe may go there as a diakonos, not a deaconess, not a deaconess. It's the plain old word for deacon used elsewhere of masculine individuals too. And I've expressed in this journey that I actually suspect that the deacons were the one that actually did the ministry. The elders were more like a board in the church, and that the deacons were the ones who actually were more like our ministers today. Mary, church worker, etc. So if Romans 16 was written to Ephesus, then we know an awful lot about the church at Ephesus. Seems like an awful lot for Paul to know about a Roman church he's never been to. Okay, although he could have gotten the information, it's not impossible. Ephesians, your first thought is, well, we know something more about Ephesus because Paul wrote Ephesians. Well, it's never that simple, is it? The traditional dating of Ephesians is around 60 to 62, while Paul was under house arrest in Rome. However, this comment in 3:2 makes it very unlikely that Ephesians is written just to Ephesus. Now, it may have been to Ephesus too, but this comment, along with the next bullet point, makes it unlikely that Ephesians was just for Ephesus. Surely you've heard of the commission of God's grace God gave me for you. This would be a very bizarre thing for Paul to say to the Ephesians in the year 60 to 62. Why? He was just there for 3 years. He was there from like 53, 54, to 57, 58. He was there for a long time. He spent more time at Ephesus than any other place of we know him spending time, except for maybe Tarsus. And so it would just be ridiculous for Paul to say, it'd be like if I were to go home to my family and say, surely you've heard of me. I'm Kenny. No, they know who I am. I grew up with them. And so this is a comment that, in my opinion, you just don't say to a church that you've just been to within the last 5 years and you'd been there for 3 years. Of course, the Ephesians know him. This suggests that at the very least, the book of Ephesians is not just for the church at Ephesus. In fact, the words at Ephesus are missing from the best manuscripts of Ephesians. And so it does not seem likely that the book of Ephesians was just for Ephesus. There are three basic options here. I had a professor who in seminary suggested that this was the lost letter to the Laodiceans. Remember at the end of Colossians where it says, when you finish reading this, read also the letter to the Laodiceans. Ingenious. Could be. Ephesians and Colossians are very similar. There's a lot of overlap between the two. In fact, there's one stretch near the end where it's 23 words, word for word. A lot of people like this option, the idea that Ephesians is a circular letter. What this means is that it's not just for Ephesus, it's for Asia Minor in general, and that Pergamum, Sardis, Smyrna, Thyatira, that all of these churches might have received a copy of the book of Ephesians. In fact, the Greek is worded peculiarly. It's almost like to those who are, and fill in the blank where you're at. Now, probably the majority of scholars think that Ephesians is pseudonymous, which would mean not evangelical scholars, but scholars in general. This would suggest that Ephesians was written as a kind of general statement of Paul's flavor, written probably in the late first century, if you go with that option. To kind of, in fact, Edgar Goodspeed, I think it was, suggested that perhaps Ephesians was written as a cover letter for the collection of all Paul's letters. Well, in any case, and I don't know what all that says because it's under my menu bar for recording. So we don't, oh, I know what it says. We don't learn much about the church of Ephesus from Ephesians one way or another. There are only two names mentioned in the whole book. That's Paul and Tychicus. And so Ephesians is the least concrete of all Paul's letters. There is the least specific, context-specific information in Ephesians of any of Paul's letters. So we just don't learn really anything about the church at Ephesus from Ephesians. But it's wonderful. Ephesians is spectacular, of course, and inspired. But it doesn't necessarily help us know historical information about the church at Ephesus. First and Second Timothy, both of First and Second Timothy seem to be written to Timothy at Ephesus. Traditionally, when were these written? Now, I'm trying to get you to think here. When I say traditionally, I mean before the 20th century, and I'm making up these dates. But my understanding is that most biblical interpreters prior to F.F. Bruce, so I'm going to talk about the F.F. Bruce hypothesis, but that most interpreters prior to F.F. Bruce saw these as written before the end of Acts. You know, the idea that at the end of Acts, Paul dies at the hands of Nero. And as I've indicated, that certainly does seem to be the flavor of the text. The text says, "Now you'll never see my face again, you at Ephesus." And as we keep going, we're going to see that this week, as we go into chapter 21, there's a sense of foreshadowing and foreboding. And so my sense is that prior to the 20th century, most interpreters thought that Paul died at the end of Acts, which then of course meant that First and Second Timothy would have had to have been written before 62. So Paul dies in 62. So we could date, if we go with that traditional way of thinking about it, Second Timothy would be written about AD 62. I looked up, John Wesley saw Second Timothy written at about 66, believe it or not. And Paul saw First Timothy written, I think 50 early. He saw it written early from Macedonia about the same time as Second Corinthians. But so these dates aren't traditional, but these are so I'm taking the traditional idea of them being written before the end of Acts and then putting the dates that would correspond to that. So that would put First Timothy written about 58, perhaps from Macedonia, at the same time as Second Corinthians, and then Second Timothy would be written from Rome while he's under house arrest before he bit the dust under Nero. Now, F.F. Bruce, of course, he didn't come up with this. It was an ancient hypothesis that F.F. Bruce, I believe, revived, and that's that Paul went on a fourth missionary journey, that Paul appeared before Nero twice, that at the end of Acts, Paul was freed, that he went on maybe to Spain or back around to Crete, back around to Colossae, back around maybe, although Colossae would have been destroyed, frankly, by the earthquake in 61, back around to Ephesus, Troas, Miletus, Philippi, and so forth. This hypothesis, now you could still say that the book of Acts is syncopating the two appearances before Nero. It's implying, that Paul dies at the hands of Nero, but that there was kind of a period there between a first and second appearance. You could do that. I mean, after all, the ending of Luke 24 syncopates the 40 days before the ascension, right? The ending of Luke 24, it seems like Jesus rises from the dead and ascends to heaven almost the same day. So that's the F.F. Bruce hypothesis. But of course, again, outside of evangelical circles, the majority of scholars would argue that First and Second Timothy were not written by Paul himself, but were written in his name around the year, say, 100. Pseudonymity, of course, people used to associate pseudonymity with lying. And so, quote unquote, liberals, even though they believed in pseudonymity, would say some guy couldn't stand up for his own ideas and so had to pawn them off on Paul, and he was lying. He was pretending to be Paul. That's the old liberal view. And of course, you can understand why conservatives would react to that and say, no, 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 there's no lying in Scripture. This is inspired. It is Paul. Now, I think in more recent times, there have been some who've taken a more nuanced understanding of pseudonymity, that pseudonymity is a literary form, and that it is at least theoretically possible that there would be no lying involved, and therefore it would not violate inerrancy in that case. It would be a literary device where a person is presenting the ideas of Paul for a new generation. And therefore, Paul it would be the author, the authority behind the ideas, even though not the actual person putting the words on the page. Well, some evangelicals are okay with that. Most aren't. So let's just keep going. So what do we learn about Ephesus from 1st and 2nd Timothy? Well, we learn that the church had eventually problems with false teachers and had a need for church order. This is perfectly understandable that the church would need, especially as the apostles began to die off, that the church would need to establish structures to keep false teaching away. It seems like from 1st and 2nd Timothy that the Ephesian church developed problems with widows and problems with autocratic women in the church. This would, of course, many point to the temple at Artemis as a reason for this, as an explanation. That the idea is basically that at the Artemisium, women were the lead priests, and that they were quite authoritative and autocratic, and that this may have creeped into the church, leading Paul to respond accordingly. That's a theory. But it does point to possible problems in the context of 1 Timothy with widows and or autocratic women. Seems to be some asceticism in the false teaching there. 2 Timothy mentions two individuals, Hymenaeus and Philetus, who claim that the resurrection has already happened. Well, that's interesting. How could that be? Reminds me of 2 Thessalonians. But perhaps the idea here is that resurrection is spiritual rather than physical or bodily. Of course, I think the Seventh-day Adventists claim that Jesus has already come back, if I remember correctly. Well, okay, Book of Revelation. Book of Revelation was written on the Isle of Patmos by John the Revelator, and it, of course, addresses Ephesus. It's possible, again, you may not like these sorts of theories, but it's possible in my mind that the book of Revelation may have layers, that some of it may have been written before the destruction of the temple, but it's generally dated in its final form to the 90s. So what do we learn about the church of Ephesus from the book of Revelation? Well, we learn that there are people claiming to be apostles there who aren't. And of course, it's very interesting to speculate who could that be. I wonder if this Nicolaus, they hate the Nicolaitans. We don't know who the Nicolaitans are. Nicolaitans. We don't know who they are, or Nicolaitans. No idea. But perhaps Nicolaitus, was one of the false prophets. I don't know. But apparently there were some claiming to be followers of Christ who weren't there. Johannine literature. I didn't put Revelation under Johannine literature because the book of Revelation has a quite different style and a different eschatology. I'm not saying it contradicts John, but it is distinct. And so there's always this debate. Is it the same author of the Gospel of John who is the author of the book of Revelation? If the Gospel of John had an editor, the one who says, the beloved disciple is the source of this information, we know his witness is true. If there was an editor of the Gospel of John, then that makes it a little bit more possible that it could be the same John behind both documents. But anyway, I'm treating them slightly separately here for that reason. John is generally dated to the 90s, late first century, sometime before 96 usually it's dated, or at least Revelation is. 1 John 2:19 indicates that there was a split at Ephesus there, with Docetus leaving the Johannine community. So I'm sensing layers of church at Ephesus. So you have originally there's a Pauline layer. Paul founds the church with Priscilla and Aquila, and so we can wonder if you have your initial core of the church that was founded by Paul, the church planter, Priscilla, Aquila, and all these people. If Romans 16 is to Ephesus, all those people would be the beginning core of the church at Ephesus. And then it would seem that after the destruction of the temple, I assume a little bit before the destruction of the temple, that the author of the Gospel of John comes to Ephesus. Let's call him John, even though we don't know exactly who this which John it is. The beloved, the Gospel of John's very cryptic about who the beloved disciple is. I kind of had a moment this morning in church. They were talking about John 11. It said that somebody refers to Lazarus as the one you love, and so as far as I know, that's the only place in John where it calls somebody the one that he loves like that. Maybe I need to reread it, but it seems to me that internally Lazarus is a good candidate for the beloved disciple, and maybe he was called John Lazarus. Who knows? But one way or another, it's possible that John, let's call him John, comes to Ephesus after the destruction or just before the destruction of the temple in Jerusalem, and that is a second layer of the church at Ephesus. That church, that group, John's group, has a split from it, a group of Docetists. Now, what's a Docetist? A Docetist is an early form of Gnosticism. These are individuals who believe that Jesus only seemed to be human. He wasn't really human. He didn't really take on flesh and tabernacle amongst us. They're Gnostics. And so you have a original Paul layer, you have a John, Gospel of John layer, and then you have a Gnostic layer. Now, all of this in the mix among these house churches there at Ephesus, it would seem to me. We also know from the Gospel of John and from the book of Acts that there were followers of John the Baptist, apparently, at Ephesus, many of whom apparently didn't become Christians. The Gospel of John seems to be written in such a way as to be instructive to followers of John the Baptist who've not yet believed on Jesus. He must increase, I must decrease. Doesn't even narrate John baptizing Jesus, that sort of thing. And so is it possible that in the mix there at Ephesus were also Baptists who weren't quite Christian, who believed in the stuff of John the Baptist, like Apollos did when Priscilla and Aquila found him, but did not yet believe, or never maybe, some of them, believed on Jesus? Well, I've done my best. This is highly speculative. I don't plan to die for any of this stuff because I just don't know. But I've thrown out some thoughts based upon little hints here and there, and we'll leave it at that for now. See you next week in Acts 21.